Hi everybody, welcome to our talk, What's Leaking, Why It Matters, and How to Slow the Drips. This is about personal privacy in the surveillance economy. My name is Dave McClure. I'm a senior security architect in the Cloud Platform Engineering Group, and along with Jim Giancarlo and Jeff Gardner, the three of us decided to look into this for personal reasons, and we found it so valuable ourselves that we thought it might be good as a talk in this conference. So we hope you find it valuable too. Before we get into the content though, we want to make sure we really clearly scope what's in this talk and what's not. This talk is really about personal privacy on the personal devices that you buy and own and manage yourself and you interact with on your home network or on private Wi-Fi or cellular networks perhaps as you go about your personal life. This is specifically not about politics or government agencies or law enforcement, and specifically not about your employer devices or your employer networks or any activity that you engage in there. All those other things are excluded. This is really about you coming at privacy from a consumer mindset in your personal life. So without further delay, let's get to it. The year is 1841, and financial institutions have a problem. See, up until this point in time, financial institutions, lenders, had been able to have firsthand knowledge of the folks who needed to borrow money from them. Typically, they would depend on direct observation or reputation in the community to make credit risk decisions. This all worked well when there was close proximity between the two parties. But in the mid-1800s, America was pushing west, and a great deal of that lending-borrowing opportunity was happening farther and farther away, 800, 1,000 miles away, and that distance created problems. First of all, of not knowing firsthand anymore what the reputation of some of these borrowers were, and not being able to observe their habits. Now, it was too expensive to hire lawyers and send them out to these outposts of civilization to spend enough time there to get that information and then come back again. And the latency was a problem too. So an enterprising young man came up with a new idea, and it was to create a distributed network of locals, people who were already in those communities and already knew the people who lived in those localities and would be able to document the reputations, the habits of the potential borrowers and send that information back to the home office where they would be able to amass a file system of potential borrowers across the country and just make it easier and quicker to make those lending decisions. The young man's name was Louis Tappan, and he created what's called the Mercantile Agency. Just a point of interest, one of the mercantile agents that lived out kind of in the outposts of civilization was a young lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Well, as time went on, this business was sold and bought and sold again, eventually was acquired by a man named Dunn, who named the company after himself, and then he merged with another firm, and that business actually still exists today. We know it as Dun & Bradstreet. Well, new business model brought new problems, unfortunately. Some of the mercantile agents were a bit unethical, and they used their power for unseemly purposes. Sometimes they were a little sloppy in their information gathering. Sometimes, of course, inaccurate information was recorded back at the home office, and that was incredibly difficult to correct. You could imagine living in Colorado and trying to correct a report on paper in New York City in the mid-1800s, where the railroads hadn't been built yet. But then there was also an additional problem, and that is that there were business owners and people living out in the outposts of civilization there who weren't in the market to borrow money from some East Coast entity, and yet their information was still being routinely gathered and sent back, and they took issue with that. A couple of gentlemen wrote an article about that turned out to be really influential. Now, the way they framed it up, this new business method and other business methods, and also recent inventions, called to light the need for personal privacy. Now, in this case, the new technology was photography and widely distributed newspapers. They described it as they invaded the sacred precincts of private and domestic life. And information that was supposed to be kept private was being broadcast. They called it the right to be let alone. Sounds a little bit familiar. If you're familiar with the modern day GDPR, that document calls it the right to be forgotten. Those arguments were laid out in the Harvard Law Review in 1890. Now, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a professional researcher, but near as I can tell, this is the first time that a disciplined arguments had been laid out by lawyers that there is actually a right to personal individual privacy inherent in the amendments to the Constitution. There are several amendments, actually, from which they make their argument, including the 14th Amendment. So why the history lesson? Well, primarily to make 2 points. The first is commercial information gathering has always been a part of the U.S. economy. It was woven into the fabric before you and I were born, and it's going to be there long after you and I are gone. Get used to it. It's actually a good thing in many cases. On the other hand, it's clear that U.S. citizens do have a right to personal privacy. So there's a tension between those two truths. What kind of activity constitutes reasonable commercial information gathering to make life better for everybody? And what kind of activity constitutes unreasonable overreach or invasion of privacy? Well, the lines had to be drawn, but recently, in the age of the internet, web browsers, particularly smartphones, and most recently, IoT devices, those lines need to be redrawn. And whether or not they've been drawn in the right places is kind of evolving. One of the things that's interesting about the right to privacy is that it's decided on a case-by-case basis. Each individual case needs to be tested in the courts to determine where the next line is to be drawn. The next step in understanding privacy in the surveillance economy is to identify your own attitude about it. You may be a targeted ad lover. You may enjoy the fact that you only get ads for things that are really specifically of interest to you. That's a completely legitimate place to be if you're there. I'm not quite sure why you're here, but maybe it's because you have a little nagging feeling like maybe there should be something that you're concerned about, and you're just not yet, and you need to be convinced. That's okay. This is really an informational talk. We're going to tell you how it is. You get to decide for yourself what you want to do about your privacy, if anything, and how far you want to go to protect it. Then there's the common consumer, which is probably the majority of us, who have some vague notion that there are privacy concerns somewhere in the world, but they don't really understand how the ad industry works and how the surveillance works, and they're here to maybe get some information. Great, you've come to the right place. There are some of you who are targeted ad haters already. You're like, yep, I don't like this. It creeps me out that when I do a Google search, within minutes, my Facebook and Instagram feed are filled up with ads for that very same item. Just tell me what to do about it. Give me the tools and tactics and techniques. Please be patient. We're getting there. There are civil libertarians among us who are thinking beyond their personal concerns and are thinking about freedoms in a civil society. Then there are also human rights and free speech advocates. That may sound like a little strange spot to put on this continuum, but I'm doing it for a reason. Just a couple of weeks ago, an Indian company was brought up on charges of criminal hacking activity. This appears to be a legitimate company that provided IT services for hire. There were unnamed people coming to them and engaging them to conduct hacking campaigns specifically against human rights and free speech advocates, specific individuals. Now, some of these people were people who do that sort of thing for a living, or perhaps were journalists writing about abuses. But some of them were just volunteers who volunteered their time for these organizations or just spoke out on their own on social media out of their own personal feelings. If you do fall into that category, you need to protect yourself, and you need to take some of the steps we're going to outline here, specifically about around the metadata of your communication and also the content of your communication. Metadata and content. We'll talk about both of those later. And then, of course, there's the unplugger, the person who just says, get me out of this modern technology stuff. Oftentimes, these people are very, very intentional about the choices they make. And part of their choice to unplug is typically centered around privacy. Regardless of where you fall on this continuum, identify it now, and then it'll be interesting to see whether you change to someplace else on the continuum at the end of the talk. In addition to thinking about your own attitude about privacy, you also need to be aware of the intent and the desires of the groups of people that are trying to get your information. All the way on the left there, we have the folks who are concerned about this from a nonprofit motive. These are people who are trying to make the world a better place to live, and they don't have any particular interest in knowing specifically about you, but there is some information they need to know about to conduct their efforts to make the world a better place. These are folks who are virtually always ethical, and they're just trying to do a good thing for people. The next group is really where the vast majority of businesses fall. They have a for-profit motive in getting information about you, but they're ethical about what they do. They're interested in following regulations. They have privacy policies posted. They give you opportunity to investigate them and to make choices about them, sometimes opting out of them if you want to. But they're ethical, and they want to follow both the letter and the spirit of the law. Those are not the ones to be concerned about. Then there are also companies who are in it for a profit motive, but they are unethical about what they do. Specific example, a few years ago, there was a company called Turn Incorporated, and they were in the ad industry. They were penalized by the Federal Trade Commission because they were taking advertising IDs, which are on every Apple device and every Android device, and they were taking that information and they were correlating it with a specific unique identifier that was being injected by Verizon Wireless into their client's web browsing activity coming off of their device. So this was in violation of the terms of service for Google and for Apple both, but it was also out of bounds for them to correlate that data with other data and to identify people based on that activity. What they were specifically doing was they were taking ad IDs from the devices, correlating it with the injected header that Verizon added to unencrypted network traffic coming off of that device, and they were rewriting tracking cookies and ad trackers onto devices of clients who had specifically deleted those cookies. Shortly after that action, they were sold for $300 million to a company called Amobee, A-M-O-B-E-E. Amobee happens to be the advertising arm of Singtel, Singapore Telecom. You get the theme here. The telecom service providers are interested in your information to sell that or to use it for their own advertising purposes. Specifically, Turn Inc. was unethical in what they did, and there are other companies that do that too. And if you're concerned about your privacy, there are steps you can take to protect yourself. All the way over on the right side is the criminal motive, right? That's anybody who's trying to violate your privacy and they don't care about rules or laws or ethics or morality or anything. You need to take steps to protect yourself from those folks as well. Now, this talk isn't specifically about security, it's about privacy, but maintaining your privacy to the level of your comfort will reduce the attack surface that you present and make it less likely that criminals would be successful against you. Everything to the right of that red line is out of scope for this talk. There are legitimate discussions to be had about those entities, but that's not for this talk today. Understanding the surveillance economy means understanding how the advertising industry works today. When you sit down at a web browser and you point your browser at a particular server, that server is called the publisher. That publisher's content server doesn't just answer your browser's request. It goes inside your browser's mouth, takes inventory of what's in there. It reaches down into the stomach contents of the browser and catalogs everything that's been there for the last few days or weeks. And then, for good measure, it takes a DNA swab of your device. That's what's represented in the gray box. It packages all that information up. That's essentially called browser fingerprinting or device fingerprinting. All that information gets packaged up and it gets sent to the publisher's ad server in step 3. The publisher's ad server sends the information to the SSP, the supply side platform. The supply side platform has relationships with one or more DMPs, data management platforms. Those data management platforms take all the detail and it looks across many other data sets that it has. It looks for all the correlation points it can find and returns it. Typically by this time, your supposedly anonymous activity has been identified, actually re-identified to you. That big ball of data is then sent on to the ad exchange. The ad exchange adds hundreds of tags based on your characteristics, areas of interest, categories of interest that you've shown previously based on previous activity, and it packs all that data together and it puts it out to auction. Demand-side platforms represent many different advertising agencies, and the ad agencies, of course, create advertising campaigns with and for the brands that they represent. So eventually someone wins the bid. That information is then passed back through each step of the way. The winning bidder ends up at the publisher's ad server. The publisher's ad server in step 10 talks to your browser and in the still open HTTP connection tells you to go grab a particular agency's ad server and grab the winning ad, which then gets served up on the web page you're trying to view. That advertising panel will often contain one or sometimes many invisible tracking pixels, and that's how advertising works. If all goes well, it takes approximately 15 milliseconds for that to get done. By way of comparison, it takes approximately 200 to 300 milliseconds for you to blink your eyes. In a very real sense, you are the product. You, your characteristics, your past behavior, your web browsing history, and everything they can find out about you is the product being sold to others. This is from a data management platform. They call their service identity resolution. An identity is analyzed between data sets to find a match. That's the way they describe it. It's a fancy way of saying you can match a person's offline persona, their physical personhood, with their online persona, which they describe as mobile IDs, cookies, device IDs, CPU serial numbers, advertising IDs, and so forth. Before we start talking about specific tools, we need to think about how we select tools. What's important? First of all, you need to think about the free versus paid question, right? Most of the tools we're going to look at are free or nearly free. Some of them have a freemium model where you can use it up to a certain volume for free, and after that you pay. And some of them are straight up paid. It's a judgment call on what you find valuable enough to pay for and what you think you can use for free. It's just something to consider. Think about the business jurisdiction of where the company is that it creates and runs the tool. That is very important to some people. For some people, they really want to have a US-based business. For other people, they actually want the opposite. They want something that's not based in the US because they prefer a company that's in perhaps Western Europe or a Scandinavian country because they feel like the privacy regulations are stronger there. Whatever the case, do your research. Think about that factor as you go about tool selection. Think about the business model as well. How do they make their money? Some of them are nonprofits funded by the goodness of people's hearts, or perhaps a wealthy benefactor or something. Others, it's not clear at all how they make money. And some of them are very clear about how they make money, and they don't try to hide anything. They're trying to be very transparent about it. But just consider that as you're looking for privacy tools, because you don't want to go after a tool that claims to be about privacy, but under the covers really isn't. Also, look for their business affiliations. Some privacy-focused tools may be affiliated with companies that make a large portion of their revenue off of the kinds of operations that tend to want to, let's say, push the boundaries against personal privacy. Make sure you know who your privacy tools are sharing their data and their information with. Make sure you're comfortable with those affiliations as much as you can discover them. Also, of course, the privacy policies for privacy-focused tools should be models of clarity and precision. Unlike many businesses that have rather vague terms in their privacy policies, make sure these for your privacy tools are crisp and clear and they're what you're looking for. Also, you want to think about who holds the keys, and this is particularly true in any kind of a tool or service where encryption is part of the solution. There are some folks who are very concerned about the company holding the keys and being able to decrypt their data, even if they promise not to, because they feel like they may get forced to by some legal process. There are both privacy tool companies and also users who would really prefer for the user to be the only one who holds the keys, so they're the only ones who can ever decrypt. And even if the company that owns the service or tool is forced to disclose that user's information, they're simply unable to. That may be an important factor to you, so consider that as you're selecting tools. Also note, just because we mention a tool here doesn't mean we're endorsing it. It just means it's a tool that maybe we have firsthand knowledge of and maybe we don't, but they are generally recommended by security experts or other people who've studied this particular kind of tool or this field. This is not a comprehensive list. And if we don't get your favorite tool on the list, please don't flame us in the live chat, okay? No offense intended. We're not trying to solve all the problems with all the possible tools here. We're just trying to get you to think about what it is that's important to you, give you a representative sampling of tools and solutions. As we start to get into the actual tools, finally, take a look in the upper left corner. That's a structure that I'm going to fold and unfold as we work our way down through the various pieces to think about and talk about. That'll just be a visual cue of where we are. Notice the big blue U. You are the most important privacy tool that you have. You're the one who's going to be making the decisions. You're the one who's motivated or not about your own privacy. It's all about you. So that's going to be the base of everything. As we start, let's look at devices, specifically the PC, and strangely enough, we actually need to start with the operating system on the PC. What you see here is an app put together by a guy who just wanted to help. These are settings in Windows 10 that are privacy related. Now you can find all these sprinkled throughout the interface in various tools in Windows 10. This guy wrote this just to collect those settings and make it easier to set and unset them. It also comes with a little bit of PowerShell scripts as well. I was not able to find anything analogous for Mac or Linux. It's possible they may not be needed there, but Microsoft does do some advertising and there is some personalization with the operating system itself in Windows 10. So there's something you can take advantage of if you want to. The big focus is on the browser. And we talked before about browser fingerprinting, kind of referred to it, and about how websites and their advertising partners go and rummage around deep inside your machine to pull out various pieces of information that allow them to fingerprint your machine and attempt to tie it to you personally. This headline says 1/3 of popular websites are fingerprinting you. It's really more than that. But here's the first tool. Panopticlick from the Electronic Frontier Foundation is a great tool. What it does is it it does some analysis of your browser and tells you how vulnerable you might be to browser fingerprinting, and it checks the privacy-based settings of the browser and tells you what you can do to fix those things. It's probably the best idea to just take a step back from the browser you're using anyway and reconsider. Maybe you want to go for a privacy-focused browser. Brave is a very good one. There are others. Firefox can be really good if you configure it right and add a couple of strategic add-ins. There are customized versions of Firefox. There's something called WaterFox. There's an Iceweasel. They're apparently, according to the creators, focused more on privacy and security. I'm going to be showing mostly Brave here in this talk just because it's easy and all the privacy bits are built into it already. First thing to look at is private browsing. Private browsing is a little bit of a misnomer. It does not keep everything private. It really only does a couple of things for you. The first thing it does is it gets rid of all the cookies that it's accumulated during that session as soon as you close the session, so you don't have to go back in and delete cookies afterwards. And it also does not keep track of your browsing history. So as you go along, it's not collecting information on what you did in the past, so that other sites, as you visit them, can interrogate that browser history and get information about you. It just never collects that in the first place. Also, Brave has a private browsing window with Tor, so you don't even have to add anything to get Tor. Tor stands for the Onion Router. It is a U.S. military research project that was originally created to keep military operations safe out in the world, and it's since been used for many, many other purposes. One of the values for you is that using Tor will basically obfuscate the IP address that you're coming from and bring you out somewhere else in the world outside of your ISP, so people can't trace your activity directly back to you, or at least it's very difficult to do. Before we go any farther, stop what you're doing and look me right in the eyes. Do not use Tor on your company-provided device or your company network. They are responsible to monitor what goes on their devices and on their networks, and you agreed to abide by the security policies of the company when you agreed to take a paycheck in exchange for your work. We said this up front. I'm going to remind you again. This talk is really focused on personal privacy on your personal devices as you go about your life outside of an employment context. Are we good? Okay, let's go. In addition to choosing a privacy-focused browser, there also may be some add-ins that you might find of value. If you look on the left side, Brave has all these built in. There's cross-site tracker blocking. It automatically upgrades all connections to HTTPS. That's important because of the Verizon injected header that we talked about earlier in the talk. That could only happen on unencrypted traffic. You want to encrypt all your traffic to make sure you stay away from that sort of activity. There is script blocking built into Brave. It's off by default. You can turn it on whenever you want to. Brave also does a great job at blocking fingerprinting, and that's all built into it. You also might want to consider an additional type of plugin as well. Brave is Chromium. It's Chromium based like most browsers are now. So they can use most of the same types of add-ins that Chrome or Chromium, any other Chromium browser can. NoScript is great. It is phenomenal for understanding exactly what's happening on a website before it's too late. If you're blocking scripting from the beginning, from the time you show up, it's probably going to break the site, but you can gradually unblock scripts, a couple of scripts at a time, and see what the browser is actually doing and see where else it's going besides the site you're visiting first party. There are others like this too. AdBlock Plus, uBlock Origin, good tools. Find one that works for you. Privacy Badger is another good one. It doesn't really do script blocking, but it definitely blocks trackers. Let's move on to your mobile devices. At the operating system level of the mobile device, you just need to go look at settings, set the settings according to how you want them to be to protect your privacy. I just linked you to Apple's and Google's respectively. You can also get a privacy browser on your mobile device. Brave offers an option for both platforms, and it has all the same types of protections built into the mobile browser that you can get in the PC browser. There's also a Tor browser available that's already pre-configured to use Tor. The Tor browser actually includes HTTPS everywhere and no script plugins right out of the box. You don't even have to add or configure anything. Unfortunately, there are no great tools for apps. You need to just check your individual app settings, set them the way you want them to be. Here's an example. Think about your tool selection criteria, look at the business model, the affiliations, the privacy policy of the app. Unfortunately, if the app includes third-party tracking code, you really can't control that through app permissions. I mention that because you sort of get that ability in a browser on a PC, where a lot of times modern browsers will block third-party cookies by default, but they'll accept first-party cookies of the sites you're visiting. In an app's case, if you give a permission to an app and that app happens to have embedded third-party code for tracking purposes in it, everything gets that permission. There's nothing you can do about that. And of course, we do have to talk about IoT devices. Now, IoT devices are really problematic because they tend to be relatively inexpensive, and therefore the companies that make them don't put much into engineering, security, and privacy into them. Sometimes they're not really updatable, which is a real problem for security and patching. And a lot of times, frankly, they're not really looking to make money off the hardware. What they're really trying to do is get the device into your hands so they can track what you do with it. It's the data about how you use it that's important to them because it gives them insight into how they can sell stuff to you. First of all, when you first turn on an IoT device, do the best you can to configure it for privacy. Don't just hit yes to every prompt. Read it. Understand what you're agreeing to before you agree to it. Chances are there's a smartphone app that controls your IoT device. Look at the privacy policies of that smartphone app as well. You have, unfortunately, little visibility, maybe no visibility at all into that app. You can't install browser developer tools like you can on a PC and observe. You don't get tracker blocking or anything like that in an IoT device. So there's not a whole lot you can do. You're going to have to rely on the network. On your home network, there are a lot of things you can do and a lot of things you should do. Simply don't use your ISP's router for anything other than a pipeline to the internet. As soon as you get it, if you can get the admin credentials, go do it. This has happened to me before where I've rented a device from a provider and gone out to the internet just to see if the admin credentials that were already posted out on the internet were still there on the device they gave me. Sure enough, they were. So I shut down the Wi-Fi on that device, reconfigured it to my liking, changed the admin password, and never touched it again. The best thing for you to do, it would be to get yourself a router or a firewall inside your ISP's router. You get total control over it then. You can configure the Wi-Fi the way you want it to be. You can get one with a robust firewall functionality. You can get one with it actually has a VPN server in it if you want to, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. The biggest thing is you want granular firewall control on a per device basis. You want to be able to block outbound traffic and get good port control. You may want to block IoT devices. As soon as you identify which ones they are, what their MAC addresses and IP addresses are, you may want to just block them from outbound access to the internet, period, for privacy concerns or whatever concerns you may have. You may not need that kind of functionality, and that's kind of the easy button. The point is you have control and visibility over what's going on your network. Use a private DNS service. Here's a bunch of good ones. Configure that in your router. The reason is because your ISP is likely surveilling and cataloging the places where you go on the internet and selling that information. If you're using a private DNS service, you're not using their DNS servers to resolve the names. And if your private DNS service is encrypting its traffic, then you get through that visibility. Even private DNS services do log some data, so make sure you read the fine print and that you're comfortable with it. DNS Sinkhole. This is fun. Pihole is called a DNS sinkhole, and basically what it is it blocks DNS requests that really aren't necessary for functionality. It's kind of an ad blocker that you can place at the network. The Pihole gives you all kinds of insight into what's going on your network and where your devices are going out, and it can block stuff that it feels is extraneous and unnecessary. Besides the general purpose goodness of having a DNS sinkhole like that, it's really important for your IoT devices. If you make this the default DNS for all the devices on your network and then send the Pihole out through a private DNS service, you'll get really good protection. And then last of all, as far as the home network goes, is a VPN. You don't strictly have to have a VPN in your home network for privacy. No matter what the traffic is, it'll be encrypted. You can get, like I said earlier, a router that has VPN functionality built into it and allow that inbound so that when you're out and about, you can use your own personal VPN server and you can get access to all the tools you have in your home network as well when you're away from home. Outbound, you could put up a VPN and even a Pihole in a cloud instance if you choose to pay for that, and you can use that no matter where you are. You could also get a commercial VPN service, and they can be real lifesavers for mobile devices when you're out, and we'll talk about that in a minute. This just gives you kind of network layer privacy for everything you're doing. So big context switch here. We're off your home network. We're now out in public, Wi-Fi or cellular, either one. The big important difference here is you don't control the network. So all those great network privacy helps that we just talked through, you lose as soon as you leave your house. Those same types of privacy controls have to come back onto your device. First thing, VPN. This time we're talking about VPN from a client perspective. So if you want to set up a home VPN on your home router, you can do that, and that's your safety. You could also, again, put up a cloud instance of a VPN with maybe a Pihole as part of that as well. Also, commercial provider, same option as before. It's just happening on your mobile device. You can also use private DNS directly on your mobile device. This is a Cloudflare app. Use it if you can. As you're walking around, let's say retail stores, one of the things you may want to consider doing is shutting off Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi constantly beacons its MAC address to all these different networks that learn it and recognize MAC addresses when they come back around again and can track your device that way, can track you that way. So if that bothers you, you can simply turn those things off when you're out and about and only use the cellular network. If you want to, you can just go airplane mode as well. You can also just get yourself a Faraday bag. These things are often recommended for car keys or especially for passports, so that as you're walking around an airport, someone isn't just randomly reading your passport information off the broadcast of the RFID chip in your passport. You can just drop your phone in a Faraday bag and it will be cut off from all activity. You lose the phone that way, but it is a privacy step if you want to. And finally, opt-outs. When all the things that you can control are gone, then the only thing you have left is to go actually opt out. The entire industry is bent towards surveilling you as much as they can possibly get away with for their own commercial purposes. If you're uncomfortable with that, you must take action. Here's some links. The ad consortium links are really good. There are a lot of players who are part of those consortiums, and you can go to one site and get 100, 200 opt-outs all in one go. Sometimes some of the big players are just not part of those consortiums, and so you need to go to the individual site and opt out there. There is another source there, a list of someone who has collected a bunch of those opt-out links. I have not spent a lot of time doing this, but I can tell you that what I have done so far has significantly reduced the number of tracking cookies my browser is blocking. On your mobile devices, there is actually an option for opt-out, the App Choices app. It's very simple. Just download it, run it. You can opt out, and you can see the results of what I did there, 50, 60 opt-outs or so, just using that app. Don't forget, your credit card company is looking at what you're doing as well and sharing that information. This is a terms of service update that I got recently. It's the kind of thing you usually throw out without reading, or you file it away without ever reading it. I read this one. They're very clear about the fact that you cannot opt out of some of their information sharing. Companies that they do not own and control, you can opt out of that information sharing. Go do it if you choose to. A quick word about search engines. Here are some search engines that are privacy focused. Metager is based in Germany, DuckDuckGo is in the US, Swisscows is in Switzerland, Quant is in France, and Cirx.me is an open source meta search engine. Notice that a couple of very large, well-known search engines are not here. That's because if you are really concerned about privacy, you should not be using them. Give a couple of these a try. I don't think you'll miss those other ones. Communication is mostly about metadata and content. Content can be encrypted, and metadata can't always be encrypted. It's usually not 100% hideable, according to the quote. If you have enough metadata, you really don't need content. That was seconded, and the money shot. We kill people based on metadata. If you think you might be misjudged based on metadata, it may matter to you to keep that as private as you're able to. The content, and we're all very familiar with that. We don't like being eavesdropped upon. Google was roundly dinged for many years for scanning every single word of every email in Gmail. They've backed off of that a couple of years ago, but they still allow app developers in there. That just makes it all the more important for you to dig into your Google settings to prevent some of that from happening if it bothers you. Yahoo and AOL are still scanning emails. You can't call that private. If you want to keep some of your communication content, particularly email, private, you can go out and get a private email provider, one that provides encryption as part of their offering. Context. If you are involved in any kind of a legal action, you may want to use one of these providers for all your legal communication. If your lawyer is using Gmail, get a new lawyer. You may want to use this kind of private email for your financial reminders even. Do you still have, say, your account balances or automatic bill payments or your direct deposit or balance reminders going to one of those free email providers like Gmail or Yahoo? You may want to redirect those reminders, get it into one of these where you know it's at least private to you. So there may be many contexts where you don't have to go whole hog away from those providers that you've been using for years and are comfortable with, but you may want to cherry pick certain kinds of communication and get this into a private email service. You can also use a wonderful tool called Signal. Signal can do all these different kinds of messaging, and it's truly end-to-end encrypted, and the encryption happens between your Signal instance and the other person's Signal instance. You can do video calls, voice chat. You can do group chat. Don't use clear text SMS for anything important because it's never encrypted. If you do decide to use something other than Signal, make sure you use an instant messaging client that supports OTR or the off-the-record protocol. There are a bunch that do. Pigeons is one of them. Big thanks to Jim and Jeff for the assistance, for the inspiration for this talk. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate the help. I really hope that you got something interesting and good out of this. I hope it helps you think. Hope it helps you make decisions. There's so much more we could have talked about. If you're interested in continuing the conversation, please reach out to me and we'll see if we can find some forum to do that. Thanks a lot. Enjoy the rest of the conference and have a great day.